You know that feeling when someone asks if you're a millennial or a Gen Xer, and you genuinely can't answer? You remember life before the internet, but you also grew up with it. You weren't anxious about technology, but you weren't addicted to it either. You're too cynical for the millennial optimism, but you're too hopeful for the Gen X detachment. If that hits home, you're not confused, and you're definitely not broken. You belong to the most psychologically misunderstood generation in modern history. Born between 1976 and 1985, Xennials don't fit neatly into any box. And science is starting to understand why that's actually a profound cognitive advantage. Here's what nobody tells you about growing up on the border of two worlds. Picture this. You're in a work meeting. Half the room wants structure, clear hierarchy, loyalty to the system, classic Gen X energy. The other half wants purpose, validation, and constant feedback. Textbook millennial behavior. And you're sitting there, understanding both sides completely, and feeling like neither side sees you. Not because you're indecisive, and not because you lack identity, but because your brain was literally wired to hold two realities at once. Here's the thing. Most generations were shaped by a single dominant media environment. Gen X had television and Cold War anxiety. Millennials had digital natives optimism. But you had both. You played outside until dark as a kid, then got your first email address at 14. You learned to read faces before you learned to read screens, and then had to learn screens anyway, every single day. Your brain processed a world that kept changing the rules. That's not weakness. That's a neurological workout most people never experienced, and it left a very specific psychological fingerprint. Let me break down what's really happening in that brain of yours. Scientists call the first mechanism identity dissonance. In plain English, your sense of self was built from two incompatible cultural scripts. And here's what this means for you right now. You became exceptionally good at reading context and adapting, without losing your core self. That's not confusion. That's cognitive flexibility at its peak. Dr. Twenge from San Diego State University has spent decades mapping generational psychology. Her research shows that Xennials score significantly higher on what she calls adaptive identity, the ability to shift register between environments without psychological fragmentation. In plain language, you can be serious in the boardroom and nostalgic at the same time, and both versions are real. Here's what makes it even more fascinating. Your brain developed during a period of maximum neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, at exactly the moment analog and digital worlds collided. Scientists call this dual coding. In plain English, your brain stores the same memory in two formats, emotional and analytical. And here's what this means for you. When you solve problems, you access both instinct and data simultaneously. Most people pick one. Think about what that means evolutionarily. While previous generations had stable cultural environments, where the rules stayed the same, your brain had to evolve faster. Not because you were damaged, but because the world demanded it. But here's what nobody talks about. There's a cost to growing up between worlds, and it showed up in one very specific place, in how you learned to belong. Think about being 8 or 9 years old. You're in the school cafeteria. You know the social codes. You learned them from watching adults on real TV, from being outside without supervision, from navigating the actual world. You were sharp, self-reliant. You figured things out without a search engine. But then something shifted. Almost overnight, the world started rewarding a different kind of kid. The early adopter, the tech kid, the one glued to the screen. And if you were the thoughtful one, the reader, the one who still wanted to play outside, something started to feel quietly wrong. Your brain learned that being in between meant being invisible. That experience did more than create awkwardness. It drilled in a belief that can echo for decades, that you need to earn your place in every room you walk into, that you're never quite enough for this group, or quite modern enough for that one, that you're permanently auditioning for a belonging you never fully receive. Think about that. That's not a personality flaw. That's an adaptive wound. But here's the gift hidden in that wound. Because you never got to coast on group identity, you were forced to develop something most people outsource to their tribe. You built a self, a real one, tested under pressure. That's not a small thing. Research from the University of Michigan Survey Research Center found that Xennials report the highest rates of what psychologists call ambivalent attachment to social groups. In plain English, you love your people deeply, but you've always maintained a slight emotional distance from the tribe itself. And here's what this means for you right now. You're wired for loyalty without dependency. That's rare, and it's increasingly valuable in a world where blind groupthink keeps getting people hurt. This also explains something you've probably noticed. You can leave. Not because you're detached, but because your identity doesn't collapse when the external structure does. Psychologist Erik Erikson called this ego integrity, the quiet certainty that you know who you are, even when everything outside changes. That certainty was forged in the analog world and tested in the digital one. So let's put this together. You grew up being told you were between generations, like that was a problem. But here's the counterintuitive truth. Being between wasn't a gap. It was a forge. Every time you translated between your Gen X coworker and your Millennial colleague, you were using a skill that took years to build. Every time you could sit with ambiguity without panicking, that was your brain operating from a place of earned stability. Every time you felt nostalgia and hope at the same time, that was not contradiction. That was complexity. The lighthouse doesn't shine because it was built in calm waters. It shines because it was built where two currents collide. That's exactly where you were built. You're not between generations. You're the bridge. And bridges don't need to pick a side. They hold. Researchers studying cross-generational leadership are increasingly identifying Xennials as the most effective translators in multi-generational workplaces. Not because you try harder, but because your psychology was literally shaped for it, always. And if this landed for you, if somewhere in the middle of this video something clicked, I want you to sit with that feeling for a second. Because that click, that's recognition. Not just of your generation, but of yourself. You've probably spent a lot of energy trying to figure out where you fit. In rooms where everyone else seemed to belong without effort. And you, always slightly observing, slightly translating, slightly wondering if you were too much or not enough. You're not broken. You were forged. And the world is finally starting to catch up to what that means. If this video showed you something true about yourself, share it with someone who grew up in that same in-between space. They've been waiting for someone to name this too. And drop in the comments. What's the one thing about being a Xennial that nobody around you ever quite understood? I read every single one.